Hey everyone, this is That Guy in Hutch, Jason Probst, and you're listening to That Podcast in Hutch. Today I did something a little bit different. We've done this a few times before, but I bring in my friend Jackson Swearer, and he takes over the interview and puts me on the other side of the microphone, which is always a little bit different because I enjoy being on the asking the questions side of the equation. But this time I let him ask me the questions, and what we go through is a kind of a reflection of the last almost 8 years, 7.5 years of my service in the Kansas Legislature. I lost this last election. We talk a little bit about some of the dynamics I think led to that, and try to be as fair and objective as I can about that, even though that's a very, real and personal thing that happened in my life. But the other thing that we talk about is some of the experience and some of the things that I learned through my service in the legislature, some of the things I found out and came to understand about the legislative process, but also some of the bigger successes that I feel that I had during my time in the legislature, and some of the things that I was disappointed that we didn't accomplish in the legislature. One of the things I think about serving in this capacity as an elected official for our community is that you get to do it for a while, and it is a privilege to do. And when you do it, if you've done it right, you should recognize that it doesn't last forever. And even though I had hoped for a different outcome and wished that I could have got at least 2 more years to serve the community, I felt like I had some more things that I wanted to work on, and feel like I could have done a lot of good in the next 2 years. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's always a temporary thing, and it is a structure that outlasts all of us. And, it's an important one, but it's also very temperate, and one that has an expiration date. And, but I think it's good to go back and reflect on that and think about what that means, what we accomplished, and also kind of think about what we want going forward, and how us in this community can work to leverage our ideas and our values and try to make the sort of government that we want that works for us. So Jackson gets to ask me a lot of these questions. We have a good conversation about my experience, about my insights from that time. Not comprehensive by any means. There's a lot more to tell, a lot more stories to tell. But this is kind of an interesting examination, I think, of the last 7.5 years of my experience in the Kansas Legislature. And I hope you enjoy this conversation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jackson Swearer, that guest host in Hutch on That Podcast in Hutch. I'm sitting down across from Jason Probst, your regular host, so that he can be in the guest seat this time. Our plan is to talk about his time in the legislature and do a little bit of a post-mortem. For those of you who don't know, Jason just lost his last re-election bid, and so we're disappointed to have to talk about that, but looking forward to that conversation, and also looking forward to a recap on all of Jason's time in the legislature. If you haven't already done so, I'd really encourage you to take a listen to part 1 and part 2 of my original interviews with Jason. I think they give a lot of great context on Jason's life and his time before his time in the legislature. But here we have Jason Probst across from me today to talk about everything that you've been able to get done in the Kansas State House in your time there. So just for our listeners who maybe don't have all the history, tell us, when did you first get into the state legislature?
I was appointed into the Kansas State Legislature for the 102nd District in the summer of 2017. It was right after I had completed biking across Kansas, and people that have been here for a while know that Patsy Terrell had won the seat before, and she served 1 year and then passed away very unexpectedly. And then people started looking for a replacement, and my name came up. They knew we were friends, and they knew some of the conversations that her and I had about that seat. And so a lot of people then reached out and asked me if I would consider running and filling that spot.
Well, I know you were good friends with Patsy, so that was quite kind of an emotionally charged transition for you to be making and leaving the paper at the time. I know came with its own set of emotions and challenges that are also pretty well documented in that earlier interview. So we won't rehash all of that history. But you got to spend 7 years in the state legislature. And during that time, you served in a variety of different committees. You were at one point the assistant minority leader of the Democrats in the House. And you got some legislation that you sponsored, pushed through, and also, I'm sure, had some legislative defeats as well that you might be able to outline for us. What are your kind of overall impressions of your time in the legislature as you're looking back now? We're a couple of months after the election, so there's a little bit of time has passed. Can you give us a retrospective on your time in the legislature?
It's kind of a hard experience to sum up like easily or in just a few minutes because it is a complicated system with a lot of moving parts. One thing when I first came in, one of the dynamics I had is I'd worked with the newspaper and I had written about the Kansas legislature a lot. So a lot of people in the building just assumed that I knew what I was doing, and I did not know what I was doing. And I think one thing that people don't realize is that there's like legislature training when you win an election or you get appointed. Mostly when you win an election, every 2 years they sit you down, they sit all the new legislators down, they bring them together, and they say, "This is how to be a legislature." They go through the process, they go through how committees work, they go through some of the rules, things like that. I never got that training.
Well, you came in midway through, so you missed out on that.
I missed out on that. And normally if that happens, you would come back the next year at the next election and you would go ahead and take the training. But that year I was in Peru with my brother. And even though I wanted to do the training, I thought hiking Machu Picchu with my brother, that seemed like an opportunity of a lifetime. So I decided to do that instead of the training. So I never got the training. So one of my jokes was I never really knew how to be a legislator, which I think in some ways served me pretty well because I wasn't really indoctrinated into some of the norms. But the downside is I had a lot of people who thought I knew what I was doing, and I really just had to figure it out myself. And so that was a little bit of a challenge coming in at first.
Explain to people how the committee structures work and which committees you were on. How does that impact what kinds of bills you get to work on while you're in the legislature?
So the committee structure is largely based on majority minority. And so the number of minority members on a committee is based largely on the number of minority members in the House. So the more minority members you elect in the House overall, the more minority members you get on committees. The committee selection process can be pretty competitive. A lot of people want to be on the big active committees like appropriations. The reason you want to be on appropriations is because you have more influence over the way the state spends money. If you care about education, that's a very active committee too. Lots of things come through there. You want to be on the education or the education budget committee. This is another thing that I was told to do that I didn't do. I was told to pick one thing and specialize in it and just become an absolute expert and have a lot of depth in one area of one committee, one area of policy. I have never liked having that. Journalism was my career before, so I view myself more as a generalist. I like to know a lot of things. I like to know enough to how to navigate a lot of different things. But the idea of like having a dedicated depth of knowledge in one topical area is not something that I've appreciated. I like having a good depth of knowledge in a lot of areas. So I've served on like the Security and Technology Committee was an early committee that I served on. I served on a Water Committee. I served on Agriculture. And that's where I did kind of find my place. Commerce, Agriculture, and those are the two main committees that I stayed on pretty consistently. Very interesting committees. Commerce deals a lot with labor issues, economic development, and commerce. And then Agriculture, of course, a lot of interesting issues come through Agriculture, probably that a lot of people don't know about. A lot of things like, what's the regulations for hauling bales of cotton around the state? How much strapping do you have to have? Those are all things that people don't think about, but they're, those are decided. What are the requirements for pesticide licenses? Those are all decided in the Agriculture Committee. I served on one committee that was really interesting that only lasted for 2 years, and that was Rural Revitalization. And that committee had a lot of information about what's happening in rural Kansas. And I'm really glad that I got the opportunity to sit on that. I served with one of my favorite people I've ever served with in the legislature, Don Heineman, who was the majority leader for a while. And but we really got to do a deep dive into what is happening in rural Kansas. I don't know that we found many solutions necessarily, but we did develop a strong understanding of the problem and started looking at what has been done and what's worked in other places.
Thanks for that. Thanks for giving some background on the different committees that you've served on. I'm curious if there's one or two pieces of legislation that you worked on that you're most proud of getting passed through the legislature.
Well, there's two pieces that I was personally invested in that I felt really good about. One is the legalization or decriminalization of fentanyl testing strips. That was a 3-year effort to get that through, and the idea is that if people who are using street drugs, we're being poisoned at an alarming rate. And I think that this is pretty well documented that all over the country we've had this rise in fentanyl testing strips. And it feels like sometimes these issues get hijacked politically. And, one of my frustrations was that the fentanyl issue kind of got turned into a border crisis issue. It was an issue long before it was politically popular to talk about it. People were dying. And one of the things that we found, and the people in this community told me, was that if people could test their drugs, they change their behavior. And this is also well documented. The idea that people are going to do drugs if they have an addiction, they're getting the drugs on the street. But what's happening is they're unwittingly being poisoned with fentanyl. And there were a lot of cases around the state. I worked with somebody locally. Brandy Harris is one of them. Her son died from fentanyl poisoning. Another woman up in the Kansas City, Johnson County area, her son, Libby Davis, her son, Cooper, he also died from fentanyl poisoning. Both of them came and testified in support of the legislation. It allowed people to test their drugs with fentanyl testing strips, which are available to test the use of drugs. But it was a criminal act to distribute them to people to test their drugs. So it took 3 years to kind of change the attitudes about that in the legislature. But over time, we were able to actually get that through in a package, and the governor signed it into law. And now it's legal to distribute fentanyl testing strips, order them on Amazon, and make them available in our community so that people who are doing drugs can test and make sure they're not getting fentanyl in their drugs and stay alive long enough to get into treatment or to reach a place of recovery.
Yeah, so that's a really important, what I think is sometimes called a harm reduction strategy, where we know people are going to be using the drugs. If we can let them have access to these fentanyl testing strips, then they'll survive long enough to potentially stop using the drugs. And also, I think, I know from a little bit of my own personal time working at the health department, there's some pretty good science and data backing that up, that if you can get people to be more mindful and more thoughtful about their substance use, then that can itself trigger people getting off the drugs. So that's a good all around. It keeps people safe, and it might lead to some long-term better outcomes.
The thing that we really had to talk to people about to really get, because the prevailing attitude in the legislature was personal responsibility and just don't do drugs. We had a lot of this like 1980s, just say no philosophy. Getting people to the point to recognize that it's not just as easy as saying no, that we understand a lot more about addiction now than we did in the 1980s. It's not a personal failing. It's not a moral failing. It's an addiction often rooted in trauma. Making sure that people, but your point about if people stop long enough and have the presence of mind to test their drugs, that's the first step to making them think about why they're doing drugs at all in the first place and getting some additional help. So that is a really important part of, I think there's over time, you try to think long-term when you make policy, or I do anyway. I know I'm not sure everybody does, but I did. I think that over the long term, we'll see that has a bigger impact than we even thought at the time.
You mentioned a second piece of legislation you're really proud of. What was that?
This one is a lot less publicized, but also very important. It's called the Contract for Deed Act, and it basically set up some very fundamental requirements for and protections when we're dealing with selling residential property on a land contract. Land contracts are basically, we would think of them as like owner financing. So if I sold you a home and we didn't go through a bank and I just sold it to you, previously there's no way to even know that transaction happened. You and I could draw up a contract and there's no record of that. And it's real estate. If I sold you a car, there would be a bill of sale and you would have to go tag it and we'd have to make sure it's a legal car and all these different things. But we didn't have even that level of protection on the sale of real estate. So that was a problem here in Hutch. We had an issue years ago where somebody, an unscrupulous landlord, was doing this and selling properties that he didn't actually have title to, or he was taking payment and he had a mortgage on them and he didn't disclose it. And the people that are paying for the house didn't realize any of this. And they ended up losing their money and their house. And so it was a frustrating thing that needed a solution, but there hadn't been any examination of this. So this provision now allows that if you're selling a home on land contract, you have to be forthcoming about whether you have any encumbrances on it. You can't sell it without the buyer knowing that. If you violate that, there's a mechanism through the Attorney General's office that can be triggered under the Deceptive Practices Act that offers some protection and legal recourse. I feel really good about that legislation. It's particularly designed to help people on the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder who make less income, who still want to have home ownership. And often their hope is exploited in this way by people who aren't playing by the rules. I think most people play by the rules. There's a handful of people who don't. And this is a way to make sure that they have at least a measure of protection and accountability there.
So those are the positive things. That's the good side stuff you got done. Is there anything that you had been working on or you hoped to work on that didn't get across the finish line? What's your biggest disappointment, if you will?
It's hard to, Medicaid expansion. That's the biggest disappointment. I really wanted to see that get through. We've been talking about it for 12 years and almost to the point that even the people who want it and support the policy are almost tired of talking about it. I think that we missed a lot of opportunities to get that done. I think we could have forced early on in my legislative career. I think there was an opportunity to force it a little more. And I think because we didn't, now the makeup of the legislature has changed. I don't see any possibility that it gets done in the next 2 years. I don't know who will be the next governor, but if we end up with a Republican governor and a Republican legislature, there's zero chance it'll get done. Kansas is in a position to be the last state to accept that. And I was really frustrated that we couldn't change our messaging around this or that we couldn't move the legislature on it. It's really frustrating too, because I think most of the legislature wants it. There's just a handful of people in leadership who don't want it, and they dug in their heels and made sure it didn't happen. But I would say absolutely that's my biggest disappointment, that we couldn't get that done in the time I was there.
So thinking about that, the reasons why that wasn't able to get done, and then reflecting on the legislation that you did see passed, but that you worked on directly, and then other big legislation that got done, what do you think it takes to get a piece of good legislation passed in the Kansas legislature?
It depends. It depends on the type of legislation, and it depends on the relationships you have. But there's a layering to this, right? Like you could have all the relationships in the world, and if the people in charge don't want a policy like Medicaid expansion, it will not happen. There's no level of, you increase your odds, I guess, if you have those relationships, but if the establishment is against it wholeheartedly and that force is unmovable, then you're just not going to get the policy done. But the main thing I think is that lends success in policy in Topeka is being able to understand the other side. I think you have to have relationships. You have to be able to see people as people. You have to try to put yourself in their position and see the world the way they see it. And I think if you go in and you're just yelling at people that they're wrong and evil and mean, and that's your approach to trying to get your policies through against a majority. I think one of my frustrations with the minority party, the Democrats, is that they have like a kind of like a righteousness about what they say without really understanding it's not about persuasion. It's about kind of saying, well, you're wrong and you're wrong and you're wrong. And maybe that's true. And maybe I feel that, but how I'm never going to convince you that you're wrong if my only approach is you're wrong and you're terrible for being wrong. Like I've got to find a way against a majority that I don't have that power. The only power I then have is to be able to move them to me. And that takes a lot of knowledge. And I think it takes a lot of understanding and a lot of trying to put yourself into somebody else's thinking so that you can ask the right questions and frame your arguments in the right way. But it's a very complex thing, but it's also very human. I mean, in our personal lives, we have this weird thing we do in politics where when it comes to political discussions, we go to our corners and we yell and point at the other side and we say, you are a threat to the future of the well-being of our country or our state or whatever. And sometimes I feel that way, but I also know that like doing that doesn't ever bridge the gap. It doesn't ever solve the problem. So at all of it, I mean, at some level, it's like we're human, right? We have to bring a little more humanity back to these policy discussions. And if we don't, and we just dehumanize each other and we continue to yell and scream at each other and we view each other as like absolutely evil or absolutely pious, that's a recipe for really bad outcomes.
So if getting good legislation passed and maybe just coming to good collective decision-making in general in our civic life requires us to work, across the aisle in the case of the legislature, or just across factions, across different groups of people who don't always agree. And that takes building relationships with those people. That makes me think of another question I might just ask you to reflect on about your time in the legislature. You mentioned Don Heineman, a Republican who you worked with on rural revitalization, who became a good friend. What are some of the other relationships that you were able to build with people, in either party, that were important to you personally and important to your time in the legislature?
Well, one of the most useful and personally beneficial relationships I built was with Henry Helgerson, who's a Democrat from the Wichita area. He's been in since sometime in the 80s, I think is when he first started serving. He's lost a couple of elections and then he come back. He's a budget hawk. Anybody that knows Henry knows Henry is the biggest budget hawk in Topeka, which is funny because Democrats get this label of, just throwing money around. Henry would call out everybody. He did an amendment on the floor one time to cut the whole budget by 2%. Every budget line, 2%. Well, nobody wanted to vote against that. Actually, it was a hilarious kind of thing that happened. He threw the whole budget discussion into a turmoil because he offered this floor amendment to slash the budget by 2%. Governor's office was mad at him. The Republicans were mad at him. The Democrats were mad at him. And he doesn't care. He's got money enough that he can finance his own campaigns and he doesn't have to worry about a lot of things that other people might have to worry about. But he just offered that amendment. Nobody wanted to vote against it. So it passed. And then the legislative process isn't as pure as sometimes we'd like it to be. Then they go back into budget conversations in conference committee and just strip it back out and brought it back out. And the 2% was not there. But his courage to stand there against the face of everyone, he knew that everyone was going to be upset with him. But his point was, we're all complicit in this budget increase. The governor's office is complicit in his view. The Republicans were complicit. Everybody in the House is complicit. And his view was like, let's just cut the whole budget 2%. And I mean, from a voting perspective, nobody wanted to be on record voting against that. And those are some of the funny mechanisms that we could do a whole episode about that. But so it passes on the floor, but then the final version of it doesn't have that. But I always appreciated his courage in that way. And he told me when I first got there, we lived together. I lived with Henry for 2 years, officed with him for 2 years. And he's been a great mentor for me. And one day I was griping about something that the Republicans were doing and how wrong they were. And he said, well, what makes you think you're right? And he really shined a light on the idea that you're not by default right. Every person in that building, to some degree or another, thinks that they are right. Even if they completely disagree with you, they think they're doing it. Most of them. There are some people that don't. They're a different breed of people, but most of the people up there think they're doing the right thing for the right reasons. And I think it's always important to recognize that. And Henry taught me that.
Henry's a great example. Are there any others you'd care to call out?
Let's see. I had a great relationship with Sean Tarwater. That was another one. Him and I served on. I mean, there's a number of them that I'll, over the years that stood out to me, but Sean and I worked together really well on the Commerce Committee. And that is an interesting relationship because at the beginning of our relationship, we butted heads a lot. He's very forceful. I viewed him as very forceful in committee, and he came in with his ideas of what he wanted to do. And there were times that I felt like whatever was happening in committee had been talked about and orchestrated before any of us ever came in. And to some degree, that's true. There had been conversations about what they wanted the policy to look like. And were we going to allow any Democrats to get any amendments on? And we would offer our amendments and they would go down. And you could see that it was all performative, that it had already been decided that no Democratic amendments were going to get on. And we were just, kind of tilting at windmills. But so I was really aggravated with him and his leadership at first. And then eventually I got moved into the leadership position on the ranking minority member on the Commerce Committee. And on that, we worked together and developed a lot of respect for each other. And we were honest with each other. And I would tell him, I'm going to run these amendments. And I would tell him and make the case, like, I want this one to get a fair shot. I think this is a good thing that's going to improve the bill. And I think we developed a relationship where, at least from my perspective, I felt like he took my advice seriously and he listened to me. And I think he respected my ability to find things in the bills that he might not have seen. And I think he also came to respect that I wasn't there to try to do a gotcha thing or put him in a spot or embarrass Republicans. It just wasn't my MO to try to do a gotcha thing in a committee or on the floor. It was more about, I'm going to make my points and say why this legislation isn't good. And if there's an opportunity for me to make the legislation better, then I'm going to talk to you about that. And I hope you'll listen to me on that. But then I'm also going to tell you when I'm going to do these things and that those things are to make a point. And I hope that you'll appreciate the fact that I'm going to make this point. And we developed a really good working relationship on that. I consider him one of my best friends coming out of the legislature. That might get him in trouble. He caught a little heat in a campaign because I used campaigns are a whole weird thing that I think damages our ability to govern effectively. Also, a whole nother episode we could do on that. But Sean said some really complimentary things about me at the end of the session. And I used those in campaign material because I thought it demonstrated very well the power of a bipartisan relationship, and that I, as a representative for this district, was able to build that and that I think serves the community. And so I used some of that, and I know he got some grief about that because politics seems to reign supreme, and ended up, I know he got some grief for that, and I never meant to cause him grief, and he knows that. Him and I have talked since then.
Well, I will call it quits on the Friends discussion there then, I suppose, Jason. Since you're on the outs and you're a Democrat, we probably shouldn't have you saying any nice things about anybody else, lest you get them in trouble as well.
Isn't that a shame, though? Can we just pause and talk about that for a minute? That's a real shame. And the dynamics of elections, and I've thought this, and I've thought it every election, and I've thought it more after this election, the damage that's created from the toxicity that we allow and encourage in elections has made it exceedingly difficult to govern well. There was a time that these elections, they didn't get personal. They didn't overtly lie. There wasn't as much dark money coming. I could show you the folder, not to get on this, but of all the mail that's sent about me, some of it is outright wrong, and some of it took a nugget of truth and extrapolated it in a way that no reasonable person could do. But you do that enough and it moves people and it creates damage. And I've seen people almost get in fistfights in the legislature coming into a new term because of what happened during election season. And the idea that you can go out and be as vicious and horrible as you can imagine being in an election, and then turning around and having to work together and put all that aside, I think it's a nice idea that in practice doesn't work very well.
Well, I think that takes us naturally to the next topic of conversation for us to talk about, which is what happened in your election. And I say that coming from a position of trying to be an unbiased interviewer and give you an opportunity to talk. Of course, I am your friend, and my wife's been your treasurer. So in the interest of disclosure, of course, I have an interest and wanted you to win. But I'm curious if you can offer your reflections on that. Oh, I want to offer one other piece of context just to explain a little bit of what I mean by what happened, which is that I have been with you and watched at least 2 or 3 people walk up to you assuming that you won the election because their sense of the community and what was going on and what they take in was that clearly you would win. I think that might reflect a little bit of the fact that our community and our country is very divided, and we're operate kind of in different spheres a lot of the time. I'm just curious, what do you think happened in your election?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that you can put into it. I think you always have to look at yourself and say, what could you have done differently? And I think you do that with any campaign. You look back and try to say, what could I have done differently? Probably for my part in it, my role in it, there's probably more doors I could have knocked or more. I knocked more doors than I ever did before. It's hard to run a campaign when you have to make a living too. And since I've done this, I know there's an idea that people get into politics and then they make a bunch of money. But I'm just going to tell you, that never happened for me. I've always had to scramble to figure out how to make money in the off session whenever we weren't in. It turns out, I don't know. I had a hard time making it financially work because it was hard to find anybody that would want to hire you full time when you're going to be gone for a big chunk of the year. So I was balancing my time between working and trying to manage family life and run a campaign. So looking at that, I could have done things different. If I could have dedicated more time to that, I might have been able to knock more doors and do more things. But overall, I feel like I ran and executed a campaign very, very well. Only lost by 294 votes. That's not a huge margin. But I think looking externally, there's a couple of things that are at play here. Presidential elections bring out voters who don't typically vote and also don't really know about the local politics very much. That's one part of it. When I talked to the clerk's office, they indicate that there were a high number of voters who came out to vote for President Trump based on messaging that said you have to go out and vote and you have to vote for Republicans all the way down the ticket. And that was an unusually high number of voters who did that. We saw that in 2020, which was a narrow race for me. That was the last presidential election. That was also a very close race. But in 2024, we saw that in even bigger numbers. Another thing that happened is all this money that came in. It seemed to me that I think at my last count, there were 12 different PACs that I saw spending money in my race. I don't know that we'll ever know the full amount because there are weird campaign finance laws that if they don't actually say vote for this person or vote against this person, that they don't have to actually report their money. And a lot of the mail that came out for me didn't say vote for or against. It just said Jason Probst sucks and then listed all the various reasons why I sucked. Those things, they don't have to report their full spending to the Campaign Finance and Ethics Committee. So we may never know exactly how much. We know that over this point, it was already hovering around $150,000, I think, that they spent from that report. But we'll see another report here very shortly. But like I said, some of it we'll never know. That's a big factor. I mean, when I was, my campaign was very grassroots, a lot of volunteers that did incredible work, a lot of people in the community helping me spread the word, but we were fighting I was the number one target for Republicans. They felt Can you just speak to that a little bit? Explain that for other listeners who maybe don't have the full statewide context. What does it mean to be the number one target, and why would you say that? That's not just you feeling that way. What does that mean? That means that the Democrats and Republicans they build a spreadsheet basically every election season. And they say these are the seats that we think we should be able to capture, and these are the seats that we most have to defend. So you start ranking those, and you say our number one target is the seat that we think mathematically most favors us. And this district on paper it's an interesting district. I've won a number of times. Laura Kelly's won governor both times. But Donald Trump wins the presidency every time with astounding numbers. It was a plus 15 Trump district in 2020, and it was a plus 18 Trump district in 2024. So it increased 3% of voters moved to Trump in 24. So when Republicans look at that, they say that should be our district. There's a lot of Republicans there. They all vote for Trump. We should be there. So that's what the targeting is. Then you do the same thing on defense. You say these are our most vulnerable seats. The math doesn't favor us the best here. And so, we make sure we work to defend those seats. So that's why I was the number one target. I also think I was the number one target. That's mathematically. The other is because I think if you find a Democrat who can win in a district that's not overtly Democrat, who can get legislation passed, and who isn't shy about talking about some of the issues and problems, the structural issues and problems in government and in the legislative process, I think that made some of the corporate money also putting me as a target. And so I think we saw that reflected in all the mail and online ads that said a lot of different things about me.
So your sense is that the messaging, the anti-Jason messaging was sort of from your point of view, the primary reason why people would vote against you, or maybe you also mentioned there is a higher level of turnout for people who voted for the President Trump at the top of the ticket, and that he won the district by 3 more points. So perhaps it's a question about turnout as well, really turnout for the top of the ticket more so than the down ballot races.
Well, I think there are 3 primary things that factored into my loss. I want to say we lost this election with more votes than I've ever had.
Oh, that's interesting. So more people, like just by the numbers, more people voted for you in this election than had voted for you in any previous election.
Yeah.
It's just also more people voted for your opponent than had ever voted for your opponent, and more people voted for your opponent.
Yeah.
So that suggests it's a question about turnout.
It's a turnout. What I think it comes out to is we turned out every vote that we had. We topped 2020's numbers. We beat every measure that we had. We beat it. I think, though, President Trump is very effective at getting out non-voters. And I think in a district that leans more, to the right, it's easier to tap into Republican non-voters than it is Democrat non-voters. I think we put a lot of effort into making sure we were trying to pull out all the Democrats, all the independents that we thought would vote for me, and I have Republicans that vote for me. I mean, when you go in and figure and you start analyzing the number of voters that voted for President Trump and voted for me, there's a good number of Republicans. I think my calculation when I looked at it was over 500 people, over 500 people in the district who would have voted for Trump who would have also voted for me. And I think that's pretty remarkable. Very proud of that. But I think the 3 things that really factor in here is Trump, the presidential election pulls out a lot of new voters, and Trump is very good at pulling out non-voters. So that's one factor. The second factor is National Democratic Party talking points and messaging does not serve us very well in these harder districts. I have a saying, and I'm reluctant to say it because it starts a firestorm of things, but there's a populist vein running through the country right now. The general sense is that government, the economy, all of our systems are not working for average people. And that is true. And I have felt that's been the case for most of my life, actually. You jokingly call me a populist all the time, and it's not unfounded.
You are a populist.
But the reason is that these systems they've degraded, and they're not working the way they should. Trump and his messaging is very good about capturing that feeling and telling people, like, I'm going to do something different, because that's ultimately what people want. Democrats, in the areas that Democrats can easily win, they appeal to their base. And that's part of what's happening right now. Everything is more blue or more red. And you're not appealing to the masses. You're appealing mostly to your bases. Democrats spend a lot of time on identity politics. Democrats tend to be a patchwork of different marginalized groups who all feel some level of abuse by the system, more so than the average person, I think. But I think the way that's interpreted in an area like Hutchinson, Kansas, is that Democrats care more about name the marginalized group, but Democrats care more about every marginalized group, immigrants, transgender people, the gay community, any minority community. And I think what happens in a place like Hutchinson is they say, I want Democrats to demonstrate that they care about every working person at least as much as they care about every one of these marginalized groups. And Democrats at the national level don't do that very well. And that becomes an albatross around our necks when we're locally trying to run elections. And one of my frustrations with this is it is not wrong to try to stand up for marginalized groups. But until you can create a message that wins elections among a plurality of voters, meaning all of those groups that you're trying to defend and stand up for, plus the average working person, and in a place like Kansas, it's going to be your middle-class white working family. If you can't make that message and win elections, you've ensured that all the groups that you were fighting for get harmed. And I think you could make that argument now. There was a sweeping victory for the real conservative politics and beliefs right now. And I think that that's part of the responsibility has to rest with Democrats at the national level and their inability to make the argument that we're working for average American families and that our policies are going to benefit them. I think we get wrapped up in a lot of other things and move away from the economic messages. So I think when national Democrats do that, and it's a presidential election, and they can pull out more voters, and they can dump hundreds of thousands of dollars into mail that says Jason Probst is just like a national Democrat, and he cares about all these things that national Democrats care about, there is a big group of voters who never investigate the truth to see if that's actually true about me. They just know that that's a Democrat. I don't like AOC. Jason Probst is a Democrat. He must also be AOC.
Thanks for giving some context and speaking a little bit to the national issues and how that intersects with local politics. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the state legislative changes or changes in the state legislature coming into the future in the next session. I know you're not the only Democrat that lost, so the makeup is changing a little bit. Can you speak to that and what you are anticipating seeing from the legislature in the next 2 years?
Well, the House and the Senate both increased their supermajority. They've had these supermajorities. I have to say, I'll get back to this, but it's a perplexing thing to me. The sense I get from Kansans is always, I've covered Kansas for a long time. I've read a lot of Kansas history. Kansans, by and large, are so distrustful of power. And yet, they keep giving power to the same people, and then they give it to them in more quantity than ever before. So we now have this same group of people who have controlled the Kansas legislature all but 3 times in the state's history, Republicans. They can't walk away from this. They have to own that they are the power party in this state. They now have enough members in both the House and Senate to override the governor on anything. They always have, but there's always been like 2 or 3 members that they could, you could move, or maybe their districts were a little more blended or whatever. That's not the case now. They have overwhelming numbers. They will be able to override. The governor can veto anything she wants. And I think that they can really render the governor kind of on the sidelines. I think she's good enough that she can, and she's able to go in and work with leadership to try to get some things of hers done still, or try to at least negotiate. I think she's in a good position to do that. But at the bottom line, when it comes down to voting, I mean, they're going to have the numbers to override her on anything. So it really means that you have a government in the state of Kansas that can do whatever it wants to do. And I think what we'll see is 0% corporate tax rate. I think we'll see some other structural changes that are so complicated I don't want to get into them, but there are some ways in which corporations factor their taxes that I think we'll see changes in. I think we'll see the school voucher program for private schools or the tax credits for families. I think we'll see that expanded. The last version that we had of that I saw, that I remember coming through, had the income level at like 900% of federal poverty level. I mean, we're talking like people that make $250,000 a year would qualify for these tax credits for private school. I think we're going to see some real drastic changes. And I think, the last time we had this, I mean, it was, I don't want to keep beating this, this dead horse, but the last time we had those kind of numbers, we had Sam Brownback and the really significant changes to income tax that later, created a lot of trouble for the state that we're still paying for. Kansas still carries a larger debt load than a lot of its neighbors. And I think it's largely because of that tax experiment that we haven't recovered from.
So I would have expected you to be a little pessimistic about the future, but that doesn't sound like you're that optimistic. Anything positive you can see on the future for the next 2 years?
I think yes, but from the legislature, I think it's going to be hard. I don't feel very optimistic about what I'll see from the legislature. I think they've built an echo chamber. I think that there's a power system up there. I'll say it over and over again. The people, by and large, not all of them, but my experience in the legislature, most of the people up there are good people doing things for the right reasons. There are people who aren't. But the system really pulls people in. And power, it is very true what they say about power. Like power pulls people like a moth to a flame. And if I had a legislator one time, we were discussing a tax bill and he was such a budget hawk. He was on the Republican side and he was a chair of a committee. And I was talking to him and I said, this isn't good. This isn't a good bill. And he said, I'll see how I get to vote. It's very common knowledge up there that if you don't vote the way the leadership tells you to vote, you can lose your chairmanship. If you lose your chairmanship, you're rendered powerless. You feel like you're not really serving your community well. All these kind of cognitive things that you go through, those things happen. So I don't feel very optimistic about the legislature. Although there'll be some small things I think that'll come out. There always are every year, some things that are just basic reforms that need to happen. But generally, I think what might happen in the public is maybe we can tone down the rhetoric. Maybe we've passed this like fever pitch of everybody being anxious and angry. I hope so. I don't know how long we're going to be able to sustain this anger. But I feel like a lot of people are kind of disengaging a little bit, at least from the rhetoric. And I think they're directing their energy more to making the world a better place and less towards being angry at a group of people because they disagree with them politically. And maybe if we build up community again and start creating opportunities for us to engage in the real world again, instead of just shouting at each other on Twitter or X or whatever our preferred social media platform is, maybe we can make some progress there. I'm hopeful for that. I'm hopeful that we can build some sense of community there.
Well, I hope for that too. Speaking more about the sense of how do we move past polarization, people pushing further and further to the extremes of the two political parties. I know that you were involved in something of an effort at a structural systemic reform within elections in this past year. You received the nomination from the United Kansas Party.
Yes.
And that is a sort of a centrist party, let's say, with a different platform than the two major national parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, which is trying to get people on the ballot under that United Kansas line, but then also able to have you be on the ballot under another party's line as well. What's that called again, Jason? Remind me.
Fusion voting.
That's called fusion voting. So that's an interesting attempt at a structural reform, a sort of a centrist moderate group that you got yourself involved in. Can you tell us a little more about that? What happened with that during this last election? Why maybe we didn't hear that much about that? You clearly weren't on the ballot under United Kansas, actually on the ballot. So why weren't you? And what could Kansans maybe look forward to in the future in this fusion voting idea?
So the idea of United Kansas and the fusion voting is that people under the Constitution have a right to gather and assemble and nominate candidates of their political party, and that shouldn't be determined simply by the two major parties having control over these nomination processes. And the idea, and it used to be in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it used to be fairly common practice that somebody would be nominated through different parties, and they would show up on the ballot under multiple party labels, and then their name would be, all of those would be tallied together and they could win the election. But maybe if you go back and look at the legislature in the 1800s, you'd see Republican, radical Republican. There were like 4, 5, 6 different parties you'd see who actually got elected. Populist would be one, Populist Party. Very famous story about the Populist and Republicans arguing over who actually won the House. And if you go to the Capitol, you'll see where they stood in front of the House doors with their guns, trying to fight everybody off. But it used to be common that you could get nominated under different parties. So the United Kansas Party is trying to litigate that and bring that back and say, you have a statute that says you can't appear on the ballot as a candidate more than once. But we're arguing that that's unconstitutional, that the Constitution says any party that's recognized in the state of Kansas should be able to nominate a candidate of its choosing. And even if Democrats and United Kansas nominate that person, that should be fine, and they should be able to get those nominations. I was, for a moment, nominated by both the Democratic Party and the United Kansas Party. So for about 10 days, I was carrying dual nominations. And at some point, I had to make a choice about whether to run as a Democrat or run as United Kansas. I chose Democrat because that's what I've been before. And I knew that I was going to have to do that. But I also wanted to be part of helping bring this case to light and helping litigate this, because I think one of the biggest problems in our politics is the primary party system, where we have areas of this state where the decision about who is going to represent you is decided at the primary in August. 2 Republicans square off. The system encourages the most Republican who tends to win in those areas. And the same thing happens in Democratic leaning areas. In Douglas County, you are not going to win a Democratic primary if you're like, well, I'm kind of in the middle. You're going to win your primary by being the most Democrat you can be. And then you're going to run against a Republican who's probably not going to win because the voters are overwhelmingly Democrat. That process is leading to an increase in polarization, and it's aggravated by decades of gerrymandering, where we make the districts easier for incumbents to win, and we make them more Republican or more Democrat, depending on who's in power. And, we saw that here. We reduced in the Senate in the last redistricting. I think we went from like 11 to maybe 9 solidly Democratic districts. So unless we pick up areas that are mixed, Democrats will only ever have 9 seats in the Senate. And I think in the House it was 37 or something. Like, structurally, that's the way the maps are drawn. And our primary system encourages the most extreme versions. So all we're doing is getting more Republican and more Democrat and more polarized and further apart. And I don't know how in that system we expect good policy that benefits most of us to come out of that. I just don't see how we expect that to happen. So I think things like United Kansas or ranked choice voting, which is another thing that's out there, kind of undercut this primary system and make it so that we can moderate who's elected a little bit, or at least give people a fair shot. That I think is going to make a big difference. And I hope that we can get somewhere on that.
So that litigation's still pending. And, as we all know, the court system can take its time to go through its processes. So we'll have to see what comes of that. But maybe we'll have some structural reforms in the future that will make it easier for people closer to the middle to win, even in this current environment.
Yep.
Thinking about the future and turning to you, Jason, what's next for you? You've had a couple of months. I know you've spent some time thinking, but I also know that there are many people who are curious about what's next for you. So anything you'd like to share?
Well, I wish I had a clear picture of what I was going to do in the future. Right now, I'm basically saying I don't know what's next. I'm working on exploring some job opportunities. I'm also exploring like how I could maybe leverage my writing experience, my journalism experience, and my legislative experience and podcasting experience into something going forward. I hear a lot of feedback from people who were disappointed with the outcome of the election, who ask me what I'm going to do next and are very, very, I have to say, very loving and encouraging. That's been one of the best things about losing is hard. I have to say that. Like, just losing anything is hard. And I think one of the things I've thought about over the last couple of months is that most people's losses aren't so public, and it's hard to have a loss and have it so publicly. And I've never been I've always been very visible in the community. I've been out there even before I was in the legislature through the newspaper. I was very, very out there in the community. And that's great as long as you're on the right side of the win-loss column. It's a little harder when you're on the loss side of the column and you know that everyone knows that you've lost. But on the other side of that, there are a lot of people who've been very encouraging, who've shared a lot of their own pain and disappointment and support for me. So I feel like there's a lot of support, not just in the community, but in different places around the state that would like to see me try to leverage my experience and the tools that I've created over my career to try to build something different or new that looks at what the legislature is doing. I still have to believe that people want good information, trusted information about what their state government is doing, and also like just good stories from around the state. There's a lot happening in this state that people never hear about. And I have got to travel to a lot of places and find out those stories. And so I think there's opportunities for that. But all that to say, like, I think, I'm kind of trying to figure out if there's a large enough community of people to support me in that to make it financially viable. But also just looking at, whatever career opportunities. I have to make a shift. I have to, we all have to support ourselves. And sometimes life tells you that it's time to change paths. And that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Well, certainly going to be a transition into the future, but I hope that you'll find a way to continue to share stories and to be an advocate for Kansans to make this a better place, a better community, a better state for everybody who lives here. Any final closing thoughts that you want to share about your time in the legislature and your thoughts on this community?
Thoughts on the legislature. I do think it's always important to remember that the people that are there representing Kansans are people. I mean, we have to remember that. They're not caricatures, and they're not one-dimensional. And I think that if you want to make a difference, you have to treat them as such. You have to talk to them and help them understand your point of view. But the screaming and the fiery emails or the form emails, not helpful. And frankly, if you sign up for those online things and you get 1,000 of the same emails, nobody's paying attention to those. We have digital tools, but it's an analog world. We have to actually make contact with people and have those conversations. As to the community, I was disappointed with the loss, and I thought that, and I was hopeful that more people could have seen through some of the things that were thrown out there. But, this community has always been good to me. And the people in the community have been very supportive, and I'm very thankful for that. And it's been really, I mean, there's been a lot of genuine, heartfelt support given to me after this, and I really appreciate that. This community has been very kind, and for the people that have been supportive of me, and I appreciate that. And I think the other thing I guess I would say as a criticism, though, is that this community has got to figure out how to like itself a little better. I mean, I just think if you listen to some of the things that are said in the community, there are people really trying hard to make this community better. And there's a group of people that seem like eager to just swat that down every time that they can. And I don't know how to reconcile that, but I wish that people would look at Hutchinson, see it the way I see it the way you see it, and do what they can to make it better instead of kind of trashing it all the time. I suppose that happens in every small town, but it's frustrating when you see it.
Oh, I'm sure it does happen everywhere, but I share that sentiment as two people who've chosen to live here very much on purpose and who love this community. I hope that everyone in our community can continue to work and strive towards making it a better place and try to build it up rather than tearing it down. I appreciate everything that you've done in the past 7 years as a legislature and for decades before that to do that. And I'm looking forward to seeing what you do next.
Thanks, Jackson.
I'd like to thank a few of the people who've helped make That Podcast in Hutch possible. My son Mitchell Probst wrote and recorded the music for the show. Jenny Brigette put together some great graphics and promotional art. And Chris Acker helps overcome my mistakes to produce a great sounding product every episode. That Podcast in Hutch is made possible through a collaboration between the Hutchison Arts and Culture Collective and Salt City Sound. They're working to bring resources and infrastructure to support art, music, and storytelling in our community. If you have an idea for your own podcast, reach out to them at podcasts@saltcitysound.net. If you enjoy That Podcast in Hutch, be sure to subscribe and share it with all your friends. You can also help support this production by subscribing to thatguyinhutch.substack.com or by emailing me at thatguyinhutch@gmail.com to learn about sponsorship opportunities. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next week.
A Salt City Sound production.